Take your plate and eat with the servants. You embarrass me at my own table." The words landed like a blade between her ribs, and Seraphine Valcourt felt the bond that had tied her soul to Caelan Thornwood for 3 years snap with an audible internal crack, a sound only she could hear, a sound like ice fracturing beneath a frozen lake. Her fingers went numb around the silver goblet. The great hall of Ashmore Keep, with its towering black oak rafters and torchlight guttering against the ancient stone, seemed to tilt. Every wolf seated at the long table went silent, and every silence was a witness. She did not scream. She did not weep. She set the goblet down without a tremor, though her heart was collapsing inward like a dying star, and she looked at the man she had bled for, the Alpha King she had crowned with her loyalty, and she thought very clearly in the cold new stillness inside her. "You will remember this night for the rest of your reign, and you will remember it with your knees on the ground." The woman beside Caelan laughed. Isolde Varn, silver-haired and rose-lipped, draped in the emerald gown Seraphine had once worn to the solstice gathering, tilted her chin and let that laugh ring out like a struck bell. She was the daughter of the Ravenguard pack, a border alliance Caelan had been chasing for months, and she wore his ambition like perfume. "Perhaps the kitchens will suit her better," Isolde said. She always did have the manners of a stray. Seraphine stood. The chair scraped against the flagstones, the only rebellion her body would permit. She looked down the length of the table at the faces she had healed and fed and defended through 3 brutal winters. Old Bramwell, the steward, would not meet her eyes. The young sentries she had trained looked at their plates, and Caelan, her mate, her king, the man whose fevered brow she had cooled with her own hands when the silver sickness nearly took him 2 winters past, simply waited for her to obey. That was the thing that hollowed her out entirely. Not the cruelty, the expectation. He believed to the marrow of his arrogant bones that she would take her plate and go, because she always had, because loyalty had made her soft in his eyes, and softness had made her invisible. She would give him what he asked for. She would go. But she would not go to the servants' table. She would go far past it, past the kitchens and the pantries and the cold stone larder, out through the postern gate and into the night, and she would take with her the one thing he had never thought to guard, because he had never imagined she owned anything he had not given her. She turned. She walked. Her boots struck the floor in a slow, even rhythm, and the sound filled the hall because no one else dared make any. She heard Isolde murmur something, heard a scatter of nervous laughter, heard Caelan say her name once. Low, a warning, as if she had misunderstood, as if he expected her to circle back to the kitchen door and take her humiliation quietly. She did not turn around. The corridor beyond the hall was blessedly dark. Here, away from the torchlight, Seraphine allowed her hand to press flat against the cold stone wall, and she let herself breathe. One ragged breath, then another. The bond break was a physical wound. It throbbed behind her sternum where the mate tether had lived, a phantom ache like a limb severed clean, and she understood now why wolves who lost their mates sometimes lay down in the snow and never rose. But she was not going to lie down. She had spent 3 years being underestimated, and underestimation, she had learned, was a kind of cover. In the shadows of Ashmore, in the quiet hours when Caelan chased his alliances and Isolde had begun poisoning his ear months ago, Seraphine had been busy. She had been reading the old charters no one else bothered to read. She had been talking to the outcasts, the rogues, the packless who drifted through the borderlands with nowhere to belong. She had been becoming something. She reached the healer's chamber that had been her domain, the one room in the entire keep that was truly hers, hung with drying herbs and lined with jars of tincture and salve she had made with her own hands. She did not light a lamp. She moved by memory. From beneath the third floorboard near the hearth, she drew out a leather satchel, heavy with coin she had earned selling remedies to merchants who came through Ashmore's markets, coin she had never once mentioned to Kaelin because he had never once asked how she filled her days. Beneath the satchel lay something more precious still, a folded parchment, brittle at the edges, bearing a wax seal the color of old blood. She pressed it to her chest for a moment. Then she tucked it into her coat. There was a knock at the door, soft, 3 taps, and a pause and one more. Seraphine knew that knock. She opened it to find Bramwell, the old steward, his weathered face crumpled with a grief he had not dared show in the hall. "My lady," he whispered. I would not have believed it of him if I had not heard it with my own ears. "You heard it," she said gently, "and you did nothing, as you were meant to. I need you to do nothing still." He flinched. "Seraphine, listen to me, Bramwell." She took his hands. His fingers were cold and trembling. "There is a horse saddled at the postern gate. You saddled it 3 nights ago on my instruction and told no one. You will tell no one still. When they ask where I have gone, you will say I fled in tears into the northern woods, and you will let them believe I am broken." She smiled, and it was not a soft smile, because a broken Luna is not worth a hunting, and I do not wish to be hunted. Not yet. The old wolf searched her face, and whatever he found there made him straighten his spine. "You always saw further than he did," he said quietly. "The whole pack knows it. We simply never said it aloud, because saying it aloud was dangerous." "Say it aloud when the time comes," Seraphine told him. "That is all I will ever ask of you." She kissed his cheek, and then she slipped past him into the dark, down the servants' stair, through the cold larder that smelled of salt and smoked venison, and out into the black bite of the northern night. The horse waited, breath steaming. She mounted, and for one final moment she looked up at the high windows of Ashmore Keep glowing gold with the feast she had been cast out of. Somewhere in that light, Kaelin was laughing with a woman who wore her gown. Somewhere in that light, he had already forgotten her. Good, she thought. Forget me completely. It will make the remembering so much worse. She rode north until the towers of Ashmore sank behind the tree line, and then she rode north still into a country the Thornwood Pack considered worthless. The Hollow Reaches, they called it, a stretch of broken hill country and abandoned mining villages that had been ceded away generations ago in some forgotten war, land too poor to farm and too remote to defend. It was, in Kaelin's mind, and in the mind of every alpha before him, nothing, which was precisely why, 6 months earlier, when Seraphine had first begun to suspect that her place at Kaelin's side was slipping, she had ridden out here, alone, under the pretense of gathering rare mountain herbs, and had discovered the thing that would change everything. She had not told him. She had told no one but the packless folk who lived here already, scraping survival from the ruins, forgotten by every pack that considered itself great. To them she had been kind. To them she had brought medicine and warmth and, most of all, the one thing they had never been offered by anyone with power: respect. By dawn she reached the first of the hollow villages, a cluster of stone cottages hunched against a hillside beneath a sky going pale and cold. Smoke rose from 3 chimneys. A dog barked, and a woman came out onto the road to meet her. tall and broad-shouldered, with a scarred jaw and eyes the grey of a winter sea. This was Mira Fenwick, the closest thing the Packless had to a leader, a rogue who had been exiled from 3 packs in her life for the crime of refusing to kneel. When Seraphine had first come here, Mira had met her with a drawn blade. Now Mira met her with an open hand. "You look like a woman who's been thrown out of her own house," Mira said, taking the horse's bridle. "I have been," Seraphine answered, sliding down from the saddle, her legs stiff with cold and grief. "And I am not going back, not the way I left." She reached into her coat and drew out the folded parchment with its blood-red seal, and she held it up so the growing light could catch it. "Mira, do you remember what I told you this was?" The rogue woman went very still. "You said it was a charter, an old one, older than the Thornwood Pack, older than Ashmore Keep." Seraphine's voice did not shake now. The grief was still there, buried, but over it had frozen something hard and clear and unbreakable. This land, the Hollow Reaches, was never truly ceded. It was placed in trust, under an ancient law the packs have all forgotten, to be held by whoever could unite its scattered people under a single banner and prove they could govern. No Alpha has ever bothered. They looked at this place and saw worthless dirt. She looked out over the huddled village, at the thin faces beginning to gather in doorways, drawn by the sound of a stranger's arrival. "I looked at it and saw a kingdom with no king, and I have spent 6 months earning the right to change that." Mira exhaled slowly, a plume of white in the frozen air. "You mean to claim it?" "I mean to build it," Seraphine said, "stone by stone, wolf by wolf, and when it stands, it will not stand because a bloodline granted it or a king allowed it. It will stand because the forgotten built it with their own hands, and no one will ever be able to take it from them or from me." She folded the charter away again, close to her heart, over the place where the bond had broken. "Caelan Thornwood told me to eat with the servants, so I will build a table of my own, and I will fill every seat at it with someone he threw away." The first weeks in the Hollow Reaches were the hardest thing Seraphine had ever done, harder than the silver sickness winters, harder even than the slow years of being made small at Caelan's side. Here there was no keep, no larder, no steward to bring bread. There was cold and there was hunger, and there was a scattered, suspicious people who had learned across generations that anyone who arrived with grand promises arrived to take, not to give. She did not make promises. She made porridge. She made poultices. She set a broken arm for a boy named Torin, who had fallen from the ruins of the old mine tower, and she sat up 3 nights with a fevered elder named Halloran until his breathing eased, and word of these small mercies travelled faster and struck deeper than any speech could have. She slept in a cottage with a leaking roof, and she patched the roof herself, and the Packless watched her hands and understood that this woman didn't consider work beneath her, and slowly, grudgingly, they began to bring their work to her side. Mira became her second, her sword and her shadow, and it was Mira who taught her to read the land the way a rogue reads it, for defensibility and water and the hidden passes where a small force could hold off a larger one. Together they walked the whole of the Hollow Reaches, and Seraphine mapped it in her mind, every ruined village and every collapsed mine and every stretch of hill that could be terraced and planted. She had brought coin, and she spent it not on herself, but on seed and tools and iron, and she paid the Packless to work for her at fair wages, which was a thing not one of them had ever been offered, and the doing of it bound them to her more tightly than any oath. By the time the first snows melted and the first hard green shoots pushed up through the terraced hillsides, the hollow reaches was no longer a place people fled. It had become, slowly and quietly, and entirely beneath the notice of the great packs, a place people came to. Rogues drifted in from the borderlands. The packless from 3 surrounding territories heard that there was a woman in the hollow who paid fairly and healed freely and did not care what pack had cast you out, and they came, on foot and on horseback, alone and in families, and Seraphine took them all in and gave them each a place and a purpose. She did not call herself a queen. She called herself nothing at all at first, but the people gave her a name because people always give names to the things they need. They began to call her the Hollow Luna, and then simply the Luna, and when strangers asked whose land this was, the answer came back with a fierce new pride. It is the Luna's, and we are hers, and she is ours. Seraphine heard this said one evening by a girl of perhaps 10, who had arrived starving in the autumn, and now stood plump and laughing among the terraced gardens, and she had to turn away so no one would see her weep, because it was the first time in 3 years that belonging to someone had not felt like a cage. Word of Ashmore reached her by the trade roads. Merchants who had once come to buy her remedies now came to the hollow reaches to buy grain and iron and wool, and they carried gossip the way they carried salt, in bulk and cheap. From them she learned that Kaelin's alliance with the Ravengard pack had soured almost the moment she left. Isolde Varn, it turned out, had never been the prize Kaelin imagined. She was decorative and vicious, and utterly incapable of the 1,000 invisible labours that had kept Ashmore Keep running. The labours Seraphine had performed so quietly that no one, least of all Kaelin, had ever noticed they were being performed at all. The stores that Seraphine had managed with such care fell into disorder. The healer's chamber, without its healer, stood empty, and when a wasting fever swept through the lower village that autumn, there was no one who knew how to fight it, and 11 wolves died, 3 of them children. The pack that had watched Seraphine walk out into the dark began, in the hollow way of people who have lost something they took for granted, to speak her name with regret. Seraphine listened to all of this with a face like still water. She felt the old grief stir, and beneath it something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sorrow, but a cold acknowledgment that the world was simply revealing what had always been true. She had held Ashmore together with her own 2 hands, and no one had seen it until those hands were gone. She did not gloat. She did not send word. She let Kaelin's world rot at its own pace, and she poured every hour into building her own. And if there was a cruelty in her patience, it was the cruelty of a woman who had learned that the deepest wounds are dealt not by the sword, but by the slow, undeniable proof that you were right all along. But the merchants brought her something else too, something that made her set down her work and go very still. Isolde Varn, they said, had a brother. His name was spoken carefully, in lowered voices, even by hardened traders. Corvin Varn, the true power of the Ravengard pack, a wolf who had never wanted an alliance with Kaelin at all, but had wanted something far larger. He had wanted a route. The hollow reaches, worthless as everyone believed them to be, held the only navigable pass through the northern mountains to the rich sea markets beyond, a pass that had been buried in rockfall for a generation and forgotten by all the great packs, but not, apparently, by Corvin Varn. He had arranged his sister's marriage to Kaelin not for love or even for territory, but to place a Varn hand near the throne of Ashmore, so that when the time came to seize the pass, Kaelin would already be entangled, already dependent, already too weak to resist. Isolde had been a knife slipped between Seraphine and her mate, not by a jealous rival, but by a patient, predatory strategist who had been playing a game none of them could see. And the pass Corvin Varn wanted ran directly through the heart of the Hollow Reaches, through Seraphine's kingdom. She understood then that her private vindication had become something larger and more dangerous than a wronged Luna's quiet triumph. Corvin Varn did not know that the worthless land he coveted had been rebuilt into a thriving power. He did not know that the pass he meant to seize was now guarded by rogues who owed their lives to the woman who ruled them. He knew nothing of Seraphine at all, because in his calculations she had been a discarded wife, a broken thing left weeping in the northern woods, and men like Corvin Varn never bothered to track what they had already crushed. That ignorance, Seraphine realized, was the most valuable weapon she possessed. She sat alone that night in the cottage she had made her hall, the ancient charter unrolled on the table before her, and she traced the faded ink with one finger. And she began, at last, to plan not merely a rebuilding, but a reckoning. The pass had to be cleared. That was the beginning of it, and the audacity of it, because clearing a generation of rockfall from a mountain gap was labor on a scale no packless band had ever attempted. But Seraphine had learned in 3 winters at Ashmore that the impossible is only a series of possible things stacked too high to see the top. She gathered the people of the Hollow Reaches in the largest of the ruined villages, in the shell of an old meeting hall she had ordered re-roofed, and she stood before them, and she told them the truth. She told them about Corvin Varn. She told them that a power far greater than any of them intended to take everything they had built and grind it back into the worthless dirt it had been. And then she told them she did not intend to let that happen, and she asked them, not commanded them, whether they would clear the pass and open the road to the sea and make the Hollow Reaches not a forgotten backwater, but the richest crossroads in the north. They roared. Mira had warned her they might not, might scatter at the first mention of a Ravenguard threat, but Mira had underestimated what Seraphine had built, and so, that night, did Seraphine herself. These were people who had been thrown away, every one of them, cast out, and told they were nothing, and now a woman who had been thrown away just as they had stood before them, and offered them not just survival, but greatness, and they seized it with both hands. They cleared the pass through the long green heart of summer, and Seraphine worked beside them, her hands blistering and hardening, her fine Luna's manners long since scoured away by rock dust and sweat. Torin, the boy whose arm she had set, proved to have a natural eye for stone and stress, and she made him a foreman at 14, because competence, she had decided, would be the only currency of rank in her kingdom. Halloran, the elder she had nursed through fever, turned out to have worked the mines in his youth and knew where the old support tunnels ran, and his knowledge saved them weeks, and more than once, lives. Day by day the rubble came down, and the ancient road revealed itself beneath, paved by hands dead for 100 years, and when at last the final boulder was levered aside, and the northern light came pouring through the gap to glitter on the distant silver line of the sea, the people of the Hollow Reaches stood in the wind and wept and cheered, and Seraphine stood among them, no longer the Hollow Luna, but something she had not dared to name aloud even to herself. She named it that night. She stood on a wagon in the reopened pass with the sea wind in her hair, and she told them that the Hollow Reaches were dead, that the name of a forgotten wasteland would not do for what they had become. She told them they were a kingdom now, small and fierce and built entirely of the discarded, and she gave it a name. Vael Maren, the words meaning in the old tongue, the land that was left. A name that turned an insult into a banner, that took the very fact of their abandonment and made it a source of pride. And they took up the name and shouted it into the dark until the mountains threw it back. Volmaren, Vilmaren. And Seraphine felt the broken bond in her chest ache one final time and then go quiet, because a wound cannot hurt forever once you have built something over it strong enough to hold your weight. The sea markets came within a fortnight of the road opening. Traders who had spent a generation hauling goods the long, ruinous way around the mountains now poured through the pass with their pack trains and their coin, astonished to find not a bandit-ridden ruin, but a governed land with fair tolls, guarded roads, warm inns, and a ruler who understood commerce better than any alpha in the north. Seraphine had learned that lesson too at Ashmore, watching Kaelin squander alliances and mismanage stores while she quietly balanced the accounts he never looked at. Now she balanced her own, and the coin flowed in like the spring melt, and Vale Marin grew rich in a single season, and every silver piece that filled its coffers was a silver piece Corvin Varn had counted on for himself. The merchants carried word of this back down the trade roads too, but Seraphine had thought of that, and she had asked the traders who valued their fair tolls and their safe passage to speak of the ruler of Vale Marin only as a shrewd rogue lord, a hard old wolf, anything at all but a woman, and certainly never a name that might travel back to Ashmore and be recognized. The lie held. It held because it was what everyone expected to be true. Powerful men do not imagine that the crossroads of the north could be held by a woman they threw out of a dining hall. Corvin Varn learned that his pass had been opened by someone other than himself in the last cold weeks of autumn, and the merchants who witnessed his reaction said the Raven Guard Alpha went white and then very, very quiet, which was more frightening in a man like that than any rage. He had built his entire patient scheme on the certainty that the pass lay buried and forgotten, that he alone knew its worth, that he need only wait and maneuver and eventually seize it at his leisure. Now some upstart rogue lord had opened it, was profiting from it, was drawing the wealth of the sea trade into a kingdom that had sprung up overnight, where there should have been nothing but ruins. Corvin Varn was not a man who tolerated being anticipated. He began to gather his warriors. And here Kaelin Thornwood re-enters the tale, because Corvin Varn, needing to move his forces north to the pass, needed to move them through Thornwood land, and the marriage alliance he had arranged for exactly this contingency now came due. He summoned Kaelin to Ravengard, not as an equal, but as a subordinate, and Kaelin, who by now understood far too late that he had wed his pack to a predator, had no leverage left to refuse. Isolde had drained his stores, alienated his allies, and driven off the merchants. The wasting Fuva had thinned his ranks, and the slow, corrosive knowledge that he had thrown away the woman who once held it all together had rotted something inside him that no one, not even he, could quite name. He rode to Ravengard, a weakened alpha in a subordinate saddle, and Corvin Varn told him, coldly, that the Thornwood pack would provide the vanguard for the assault on the pass. Kaelin's warriors would bleed first against the defences of Vile Marin, and Ravengard would follow to claim the prize. Kaelin understood, in that moment, that he had been a pawn from the first, that Isolde had never been a bride, but a leash, and that the price of his arrogance was to spend his own people's lives clearing the way for another wolf's crown. He came home to Ashmore, a hollow man, and there, in the empty healer's chamber, where dried herbs still hung brittle from the rafters, Bramwell, the old steward, found him, standing among the ghosts of Seraphine's work, and the steward, who had waited a long time for this, at last said the thing aloud that he had promised her he would say when the time came. "She saw further than you did," Bramwell said. "The whole pack knew it. We simply never dared say so, because you would not have heard it." Kaelin turned on him, but there was no force in it, and the old man didn't flinch. "You told her to eat with the servants," Bramwell went on, relentless now, 3 years of swallowed grief pouring out of him. "And she walked out that door with her head high, and I saddled the horse that carried her, and I have thanked the moon every night since that she was clever enough to escape a fool who could not see the treasure he held in his own hand." Kaelin struck him then, a backhand blow that sent the old steward staggering into the herb shelves, and Bramwell caught himself and straightened and wiped the blood from his lip and looked at his alpha with something worse than hatred. He looked at him with pity. "She is out there somewhere, my king," Bramwell said quietly. "Building. She was always building. And you are here, tearing down the last of what she made. Corvin Varn will spend your pack like coin, and you will let him, because you have forgotten how to be anything but a fool who takes, and never once asks what he is destroying." Then the old man walked out, and Kaelin stood alone among the drying herbs, and for the first time in 3 years he understood exactly what he had lost, and the understanding was a phantom pain behind his own sternum, an echo of the bond he himself had severed, and it did not ease, and he knew it never would. Seraphine's scouts, ranging far down the trade roads, brought her word of the gathering storm before it broke. She learned that a combined force was marshalling to the south, that the Thornwood pack would form its vanguard, and that Kaelin himself would ride at its head. She sat with this knowledge for a long time in her hall in Vale Maren, and Mira watched her across the firelight and finally said what they were both thinking. "He is coming here. Do you want him to know it's you? Or do you want to break him without his ever learning whose blade did it?" Seraphine considered the question with the cold clarity that had become the bedrock of her being. Part of her, the part that still carried the phantom ache of the broken bond, wanted him to know, wanted to watch his face when he understood that the wife he had cast into the servants' quarters now held his life and his people's lives in her palm. But that was the cheap revenge, the loud kind, and she had promised herself in the corridor beyond the great hall of Ashmore that hers would be served cold. "No," she said, "not yet. Let him come blind. Let Corvin Varn come blind. A man who thinks he is attacking a rogue lord's ragged holding fights very differently than a man who knows he is walking into a fortified kingdom built by the woman he underestimated. We will use their contempt the way I have used contempt my whole life, as cover." She rose and walked to the great map she had made of Vale Maren, every pass and terrace and hidden way marked in her own hand. "We do not meet them in the open. We let them into the pass, deep into the pass, where the walls are sheer and the ground is ours, and there we close the door behind them and the door before them, and we do not spill a single drop of blood. We do not have to. I did not build this kingdom to turn it into a graveyard." She traced the narrow throat of the pass with one finger. "We take their army whole. We take it without breaking it. And then, when Corvin Varn stands helpless in the heart of the land he thought was empty, then I will let him see my face. And Kaelin. Then. Not before." They laid the trap through the last hard weeks before winter, and every soul in Vale Maren had a part in it, for Seraphine had built a kingdom in which no one was too lowly to matter, and so no one held back. The old miners, Halloran chief among them, showed the warriors how the ancient tunnels honeycombed the mountains flanking the pass, how a force could be moved unseen above and behind an enemy who thought the heights impassable. Thorin's stone crews prepared the rock falls, not to crush but to seal, wedging boulders in the high defiles, so that a few blows of a hammer could bring down a wall of stone across the pass at either end on command. Mira drilled the fighters, rogues and packless, who had never fought as a unit in their lives, and now moved with the grim discipline of people defending the only home that had ever wanted them. And Seraphine oversaw all of it, sleeping little, eating less, her mind a cold engine of calculation, and if in the small hours she sometimes pressed her hand to the old wound in her chest, and remembered a fevered brow she had cooled, and a man she had loved before he taught her what he was, she told no one, and by morning the memory was locked away again behind the work. Corvin Varn's army entered the pass on a grey morning when the first snow hung threatening in the iron sky. They came exactly as Seraphine had foreseen, the Thornwood vanguard first, wary but contemptuous, expecting a rogue lord's rabble, finding instead an empty road and silence. Cailan rode at their head. Seraphine watched him from a concealed vantage high in the rocks, and she was surprised by how little she felt at the sight of him, this man who had once been the axis of her entire world. He looked older. He looked diminished, riding not as a king but as a driven beast, and behind him Corvin Varn's Ravenguard warriors pressed forward, hemming the Thornwood pack in from behind, making certain they could not retreat, making certain they bled first. Seraphine's cold heart registered the cruelty of that arrangement, and registered too that Cailan surely understood it, that he was leading his own people into a killing ground at the whip-horn of the wolf who had ruined him, and she found, to her own surprise, that she didn't want the Thornwood pack to die. They had lowered their eyes when she was cast out. They had done nothing. But they were also the young sentries she had trained and the families she had fed, and 11 of them had already died of a fever she could have stopped, and she would not add to that toll if her plan held. She let them come deep. She let the whole combined force, thousands of warriors, thread its way into the narrow throat of the pass, where the walls rose sheer and pitiless on either side, and when the very last of Corvin Varn's rearguard had passed beneath the high defiles, she gave the signal, a single arrow, trailing red smoke, arcing up into the grey morning. Thorin's hammers fell. The rock falls came down, first at the southern mouth of the pass, sealing the army's retreat, and then, a heartbeat later, at the northern mouth, sealing its advance. And the sound of it was like the mountains themselves closing a fist. Thousands of warriors stood trapped in a stone corridor, and above them, appearing suddenly along both ridgelines, where no enemy should have been able to stand, rose the fighters of Vale Maren, hundreds of them, arrows nocked and stones ready, holding every high point, holding the killing advantage utterly and completely, and not one of them loosed a shaft, because Seraphine had commanded that not one of them would, unless she gave the word. The silence after the rock falls was enormous. Corvin Varn's army, expecting to sack a ragged holding, understood in an instant that it had marched into a fortress with no roof and no exit, that every soul within it lived or died at the pleasure of whoever commanded those heights. Panic rippled through the trapped ranks, and then died, because there was nothing to do, nowhere to run, no enemy to charge. And into that silence Seraphine walked. She came down a path in the eastern wall that her people had cut in secret weeks before, and she came alone, unarmored, dressed not in a warrior's leather, but in a simple gown, the deep green of the mountain pines, and she walked out onto a wide shelf of rock that overlooked the whole trapped host, and she stopped there where every wolf below could see her, and she waited. The wind pulled at her hair. Below her, thousands of faces turned up toward the woman who had caged them, and among those faces she found the two she was looking for. Corvin Varn, near the center, silver-haired like his sister and cold-eyed as a hunting bird, staring up at her with the dawning fury of a man who has been outplayed and does not yet know by whom, and Kaelin Thornwood, near the front, looking up, and she watched the exact moment the recognition struck him, watched his face empty of color, watched his mouth open and shape a word that the wind carried up to her thin and broken. Her name, Seraphine. "You do not command here," she called down, and her voice carried in the stone amphitheater the mountains had made, clear and unhurried and cold. "Neither of you. Not the Alpha King of the Thornwood Pack, and not the true master of Raven Guard, who hides his ambition behind his sister's face. You are in Vale Marin now, and in Vale Marin you kneel or you do not leave." Corvin Varn found his voice first, and it was a snarl. "You are the rogue lord who opened the pass? A woman?" He spat the last word as though it were an obscenity, and Seraphine let a thin, cold smile touch her mouth, because his contempt was the last and sweetest confirmation that she had judged him rightly, that men like him would rather die than imagine a woman had beaten them. "I have 5,000 warriors." "You have 5,000 hostages," Seraphine corrected him, and the calm in her voice was more devastating than any shout. "Every one of them beneath the bows of my people. I could empty this pass of life in the time it takes you to finish threatening me, and I could do it without losing a single wolf of my own. I do not wish to. I did not build this kingdom to fill it with corpses, but do not mistake mercy for weakness, Corvin Varn. That was the mistake made by the last man who underestimated me, and look what it has cost him." She turned her gaze then, deliberately, down to Kaelin, and the whole trapped army seemed to hold its breath as the ruler of Vale Marin looked upon the Alpha King who had cast her out. "Seraphine," Kaelin said again, and this time the wind let his voice reach her whole, and it was thick with something she had never heard in it before. Not command, not contempt, but a raw and ruined grief. "I did not know. The land, they said it was empty. I did not know it was you." "No," she agreed, and her voice was almost gentle, which was the cruelest thing she could have made it. "You did not know. You never knew. That was always the trouble, Kaelin. You looked at me for 3 years, and you never once saw what you were looking at. You told me to take my plate and eat with the servants because I embarrassed you. Do you remember?" She saw him flinch as though struck, saw the words land exactly where she had aimed them, in the same place his words had landed in her 3 years before. "I remember. I have remembered every day since. And here is the thing you couldn't see then and can see now. From the bottom of the hole you marched yourself into, I didn't need your table. I built my own. And I filled every seat at it with someone you or your kind threw away, and together we made a kingdom out of the dirt you called worthless, and now that kingdom holds your life in its hand." She spread her arms to take in the heights, the bows, the hundreds of silent, watchful faces of the discarded. "You built the gallows, Kaelin. You and every alpha before you, who looked at the forgotten and saw nothing. We bought the lumber. We built it into something that will outlast you all." For a long moment, nothing moved in the pass, but the wind. Corvin Varn's face had gone through fury, and arrived somewhere colder. The still calculation of a predator that has understood, too late, that it is the one in the snare. He was recalculating everything. Seraphine could see it. Every certainty he had carried into these mountains, collapsing and reforming into a single desperate question. Was there any hand left to play? She let him look for it. She wanted him to search and find nothing, because a man who surrenders with hope still burning is a man who will rise again the moment your back is turned. And Seraphine didn't build in order to fight the same war twice. "You want the pass," she said to him, and her voice carried down cold and even. "You wanted it before any of us knew its worth. You arranged a marriage to place your knife near a throne. You spent months poisoning a fool against his own wife, and you did all of it to seize a road you believed lay buried and forgotten. It was a good scheme, Corvin Varn. Patient, cruel. I've admired it, in the way one admires a well-set trap, even as one steps around it." She let the acknowledgement sit, watched it fail to comfort him. "But you made the same error every powerful man makes. You believed the people beneath your notice were beneath your consideration. You looked at this land and saw empty dirt. You looked at your sister's marriage and saw a leash on Kaelin. You never once asked what became of the woman he cast aside, because in your ledger she was already crossed out." She smiled without warmth. "I have made a life out of being the line no one bothered to read, and now I am the only line that matters." "Name your price," Corvin Varn said. The words came out flat, stripped of everything but the bare arithmetic of survival, and Seraphine understood that this was the closest a man like him would ever come to kneeling. It was not enough, but it was a beginning. "The price is Ravengard's seal on a treaty I have already written," she said. "You will renounce, in ink, before witnesses from 3 packs I have already summoned, and who wait even now beyond the northern mouth of this pass, any claim your bloodline has ever held or will ever hold to the hollow reaches, which are dead, and to Vale Maren, which lives. The pass is mine. The tolls are mine. Ravengard may trade through it like any other pack, paying like any other pack, protected on my roads like any other pack, and if you ever again raise a single blade against this kingdom, the treaty you sign today becomes the rope by which every allied pack in the north hangs your name." She descended 1 step lower on the shelf, so that the growing light fell full across her face, and there could be no mistaking her, no pretending later that some phantom rogue lord had bested him. "That is the price for your life and the lives of your 5,000. Refuse it, and I will not have to loose a single arrow. I will simply seal the pass again and leave you all in the dark to decide among yourselves who eats whom. I built these mountains into a door, Corvin Varn. I would rather open it, but I am entirely prepared to close it." He signed. It took the better part of an hour to bring the witnesses down through the eastern path, 3 grim alphas of the smaller packs, whom Seraphine had cultivated quietly through the summer, with fair trade and fairer words, packs who had chafed for a generation under the arrogance of the great houses, and who understood instantly the value of a new power that treated them as equals. They watched Corvin Varn set his seal to the treaty with the expressionless satisfaction of men witnessing a tyrant made to bow, and each of them set his own seal beneath hers, binding themselves to the defense of Vale Maren, so that in a single morning, in a sealed mountain pass, Seraphine Valcourt did not merely defeat an army. She founded an alliance. Corvin Varn rode out through the reopened northern mouth of the pass, a diminished wolf, his grand patient scheme reduced to a toll he would pay for the rest of his life, and Seraphine watched him go and felt neither triumph nor pity, but only the quiet settling of a thing set finally right. Which left Kaelin. She had the Thornwood pack held apart, separated from the Ravengard host as it filed out, and when the pass was empty at last, but for her own people on the heights and the ragged, disarmed vanguard on the stones below, she came down the eastern path a second time and walked among them on level ground, and she saw up close the ruin of what she had left behind. These were her sentries, grown gaunt. These were the families she had fed, thin now and frightened. And these were the survivors of a fever that had killed 11 of their own for want of a healer, and they looked at her the way the drowning look at a shore, and something in Seraphine's chest that she had frozen solid 3 years ago cracked, just slightly, just enough. Kaelin stood among them, and when she stopped before him, the whole pack fell back, leaving the two of them alone in a ring of watching faces. Up close, he was worse than he had seemed from the heights. He had aged a decade in 3 years. His eyes, which had once looked through her as though she were furniture, could not now leave her face. "I have no words that will mend it," he said, low, and there was no command left anywhere in him, and that absence was the most terrible change of all. "I know that. I knew it the moment I recognized you on the rocks. Everything Bramwell said to me was true, every word, and I struck him for it, and I have been ashamed of my own hand ever since." He swallowed. "I traded you for an alliance that was a leash. I let a viper into my house because she flattered me, and you did not. I called your loyalty softness and your work invisible, and I only understood what you were when you were gone, and everything you carried came crashing down because there was no one left to carry it." He looked as though he might reach for her and did not dare. "I do not ask you to take me back. I have no right to your forgiveness, let alone your bed or your throne. I ask only, my people. They are dying, Seraphine, not for anything they did, for what I did. If there is any mercy left in you, spend it on them and not on me." It was, she recognized, the first genuinely selfless thing she had ever heard Kaelin Thornwood say. It had taken the loss of everything to teach it to him. She looked at him for a long time, and she thought of the fevered brow she had cooled and the winters she had held together with her own 2 hands. And she thought of the great hall and the silver goblet and the words that had ended one life and begun another. And she found that the grief was there still, small and quiet, but that it no longer commanded her. "I stopped needing your table a long time ago," she said, "and I stopped wanting your throne the day I understood what it had cost me to sit beside it. There is nothing you have that I want, Kaelin. That is why I can be kind to you. Kindness is easy when it costs nothing." She turned from him then to the gaunt, frightened faces of the Thornwood pack, and she raised her voice so all of them could hear. "Your Alpha marched you into these mountains to die as another wolf's shield. I will not send you home to starve as his monument to a mistake. Vael Marin will send healers to Ashmore for your fever and grain for your winter, and any wolf among you who no longer wishes to serve the man who spent your lives like coin may cross the pass and make a home in my kingdom, where competence is the only rank and no one, ever, eats with the servants as a punishment, because in Vaelmaren there is no such table and there never will be." She watched the words land. She watched hope come into faces that had forgotten it. And she watched perhaps a third of the Thornwood pack, over the days that followed, do exactly as she offered, gathering their families and their few possessions, and walking north through the reopened pass into a land that had been dirt and was now a kingdom, and she took every one of them in. Bramwell came among them, the old steward, his lip still healing from Caelan's blow. And when he saw her, he wept openly and unashamed, and she embraced him and said only, "You said it aloud when the time came. That was all I ever asked." She made him steward of Vale Maren, and he served her with a devotion that Caelan had never earned until the end of his long life. Caelan himself rode home to a hollowed pack and a keep gone cold, and he did not follow her north because he understood at last that the one grace he could offer her was to never again ask her for anything. Isolde had fled Ashmore the moment word came that her brother's scheme had collapsed, running to Ravengard to find a brother diminished and a house in disgrace, and she found no welcome there, only the cold arithmetic of a family that had spent her and now had no further use for the coin. She ended, the merchant said, married off to some minor lord in a distant pack, decorative to the last and dependent to the last, and Seraphine, when she heard it, felt nothing at all, which was its own kind of freedom. Vile Maren grew. The kingdom that had begun as a leaking cottage and a folded charter became, within a few short years, the beating heart of the northern trade, a crossroads where the wealth of the sea flowed south and the goods of the inland packs flowed north, all of it passing through roads that Seraphine kept safe and tolls that Seraphine kept fair. The discarded came to her from every corner of the world, the packless and the exiled and the thrown away, and she took them in and gave them each a place, and the kingdom she built was strong, not despite being made of the abandoned, but because of it. Because there is no loyalty in all the world fiercer than the loyalty of those who have finally, after a lifetime of being told they were nothing, been shown that they are wanted. Torrin grew into her master builder, raising a true hall of pale mountain stone on the shelf of rock where she had first shown herself to the trapped army, so that the seat of her power stood forever on the spot of her vindication. Mira remained her second, and her sword until age slowed her, and then became her most trusted counsellor, grey and scarred and content. And Halloran lived to see the mines he had once broken his body in reopened under fair conditions, worked by free wolves who owned a share of what they dug, and he died an old man in a warm bed, which was more than the world had ever seemed likely to grant him. Seraphine Valcourt ruled Vale Maren for 30 years, and she ruled it well, and she never married again, though many came courting the wealthy queen of the north, because she had learned in the sharpest possible school that a bond given to the wrong hands is a wound waiting to be dealt, and she preferred the company of those who respected her competence to the company of any who wanted her crown. She was not lonely. A kingdom of the grateful is a great many kinds of family, and if, on the coldest nights of deep winter, she sometimes pressed her hand to the old place beneath her sternum, where a bond had once broken, with a sound like ice, cracking on a frozen lake, she did so not with grief any more, but with something closer to gratitude, because that breaking had been the beginning of everything, and a woman who has built a kingdom out of the worst night of her life learns in time to be thankful even for the blade. Caelan Thornwood outlived his usefulness to the world by many quiet years. The Thornwood pack, thinned by his mistakes, and thinned again by those who chose Vile Maren, dwindled into a minor house, and Caelan dwindled with it, an alpha of nothing much, remembered by his remaining people not for any greatness, but for the single unforgivable act that had cost them everything. He had held the treasure of the north in his own 2 hands, and told it to go eat with the servants. That was how the story was told, in Ashmore and in Vile Maren, and along all the trade roads between, and Caelan knew it was told so, and he did not dispute it, because it was true, and because he understood at last that the only honest thing left to him was to be a warning. He died alone in a cold keep, and Seraphine, when the word reached her in her hall of pale stone, sat for a long while in silence, and then she sent, as her final mercy and her final indictment both, a single healer to see him decently buried, because he had once, before he learned what he was, been a man whose fevered brow she had cooled with her own hands, and she was not, in the end, the kind of woman who let even her enemies rot unburied. Mercy, she had learned across a lifetime, is the deepest dominance of all, because it can only be given by the one who has won. And so the tale comes to rest where all such tales should, not in the loud clash of a battle, but in the quiet certainty of a woman who reclaimed her worth on her own terms. Seraphine Valcourt was told to take her plate and eat with the servants, and she walked out of that gilded cage into the cold and the dark with nothing but a satchel of coin she had earned herself, and a charter no one else had bothered to read. And she built from the very dirt her betrayers despised a kingdom that outshone them all. She proved the thing that every discarded soul most needs to know and least dares to believe, that your worth was never theirs to grant, and so it was never theirs to take away. They can cast you from the table. They cannot cast you from yourself. And if they are foolish enough to throw you into the wilderness, believing you are broken, they will one day look up to find you standing on the heights they thought were empty, holding in your open hand the very power they spent their lives chasing, choosing in your mercy to let them live. Loyalty cannot be bought, and it cannot be commanded, and it can never be recognized by those too proud to see it until it is gone. True strength is not inherited from a bloodline or granted by a crown. It is built, stone by stone, and wound by wound, by those the world was careless enough to underestimate. And the deepest revenge a discarded soul can take is not to destroy the ones who threw them away, but simply to rise so high, so completely, and on their own terms so wholly, that the betrayer is left to spend the rest of their days living inside the enormity of what they let go. If this story moved you, if you felt the ice crack in your own chest when Seraphine set down that goblet and walked out into the dark, and if you felt something rise in you when she stood on that shelf of rock and told the men who discarded her that they built the gallows and she bought the lumber, then do this one small thing before you go. Give this video a like, because it tells the story of Wael Maren to more people who need to hear it. Share it with someone in your life who has been made to feel small, someone who was told to eat with the servants in whatever form that cruelty took in their world, someone who needs the reminder that their worth was never anyone else's to grant or to take. Subscribe and join this community, because we tell these stories here again and again, the stories of the underestimated who rise, the discarded who build, the quiet ones who walk out with dignity and return holding a kingdom, and you belong among people who celebrate that kind of strength. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what was the moment you would have walked out on Kaelan? Was it the goblet? Was it the laugh? Or was it the terrible instant when you realized he simply expected her to obey? Tell me where your ice cracked. I read everyone, and I am always moved by the stories you carry, because every one of you has a Wael Maren inside you, waiting to be built.